The worst maritime disaster in American history killed more people than the Titanic, and almost nobody has heard of it. It happened on a river, not an ocean. The dead were nearly all soldiers who had just survived prison camps and were on their way home. And it was pushed off the front pages because a more famous man had been shot the day before. This is quilled history, the stories the textbooks quietly left out. So how do you fit 6 times a boat's legal capacity onto it, and why would anyone want to? What actually failed, and was it known to be failing beforehand? And how does an event that killed well over 1,000 Americans vanish from the national memory almost completely? Set the date, because the date is half the story. It is April 1865. The American Civil War has just ended. Lee surrendered on the 9th. Lincoln was shot on the 14th and died the next morning. And on the 26th, the man who shot him was cornered in a barn in Virginia and killed. The disaster happened in the early hours of the 27th. One day after the most covered manhunt in the country's history ended. The newspapers had no room and no appetite, and a nation that had spent 4 years counting war dead had lost its capacity to be shocked by a number. Now the cargo, which is the part that makes this unbearable. As the war ended, tens of thousands of Union prisoners were released from Confederate camps, including 2 of the worst. Men came out of them emaciated, sick, and barely able to walk, and they were gathered at a camp near Vicksburg to be sent north. The camps they had come out of deserve naming for what they were. The largest held tens of thousands of men in an open stockade with no shelter, a single fouled stream for water and sanitation, and a mortality rate that killed roughly a quarter of everyone who entered. Men left it weighing under 50 kilograms. These were men who had survived the worst thing that had happened to them, been told it was over, and were going home. Several survivor accounts describe the mood aboard as almost unbearable happiness. That is who was standing on the decks. Here is the mechanism that put them all on one boat. The government paid steamboat operators per head to carry released prisoners north. A few dollars for an enlisted man, more for an officer. With thousands waiting, a full boat was a substantial payday, and the officers ashore decided which boat got the men. There were other steamboats at Vicksburg that week. At least 2 left going north with almost nobody aboard, while this one was loaded past every reasonable limit. Testimony afterwards described money changing hands to make sure the prisoners went onto this particular vessel, and the accusation was never resolved. Her legal capacity was 376 people, including crew. Estimates of how many were actually aboard when she left run from about 2,100 to over 2,400. Nobody knows precisely, because the loading was chaotic and the manifest was not reliable. The decks sagged under the weight and had to be shored up with extra timber props before she sailed. Men were packed so tightly that many could not lie down. And the boat was top-heavy and unstable, so when the crowd shifted to one side to look at something, she listed noticeably. Now the boiler. And this is the failure that everything else amplified. Days earlier, at Vicksburg, one of her 4 boilers was found to be bulging and leaking. A boilermaker examined it and said the proper repair was to remove the bulged sheet and replace it, which would take several days. The boat's officers did not want to lose several days, because the men and the payment were waiting. So a patch was riveted over the bulge instead, and the patch used metal thinner than the original plate. It was a repair that let her sail that week rather than the next. At the river, the Mississippi was in spring flood, running high, fast and cold, and the boat was fighting the current the whole way upstream, which means the boilers were working hard, and her design used interconnected tubular boilers, which are efficient and are also sensitive to the water level inside them not staying even. That combination is the accepted explanation. A badly listing overloaded boat on a fast river causes water to slosh from side to side inside the connected boilers. Metal briefly uncovered by water gets extremely hot. When water surges back across it, it flashes instantly to steam, and the pressure spike has nowhere to go. At around 2 in the morning on the 27th, about 7 miles north of Memphis, 3 of the 4 boilers exploded. The blast tore upward and forward through the center of the boat, destroying the decks where the greatest number of men were sleeping and throwing debris and people into the river. Then the boat caught fire, which turned a disaster into a slaughter. The wooden superstructure burned fast, and the fire drove everyone still aboard into the water. the twin smokestacks fell. Men who had not been killed by the explosion faced a choice between burning and a flooded river in the dark. And most of them could not swim well, and almost all of them were starved and weakened from months in prison camps. The water was cold and moving fast, and the flood had spread the river wide across the surrounding land, so the banks were much further away than they looked. Survivors clung to debris, to floating bales, to each other, and drifted downstream for hours. Rescue boats came out from Memphis and picked people out of the water through the rest of the night and into the morning. Some were found miles downstream. Many who were pulled out alive died of exposure afterwards. The first rescue came from a steamboat heading downstream that saw the fire and turned back, pulling people from the water for hours. Others followed from Memphis, along with small boats from both banks. Soldiers stationed nearby waded into the flooded shallows to drag men out. Around 700 people were recovered alive. Around 300 of those died in the following days from burns, exposure, and the effects of scalding steam, in hospitals in Memphis that had been set up for war casualties and were now receiving men who had already been discharged from the war. The commonly cited death toll is about 1,168, and serious estimates run as high as 1,800. Either figure exceeds the Titanic. The uncertainty exists because nobody could say with confidence how many had boarded in the first place. There were investigations, several of them, and they produced the outcome you can probably already predict. Responsibility diffused across enough people that it settled on nobody. The quartermaster most heavily implicated in the loading never faced meaningful consequences and avoided testifying. One officer was court-martialed and convicted of overloading the boat, and the conviction was later overturned. He appears to have been the most convenient available name, rather than the most responsible one. No one served a sentence for the deaths of over 1,000 men. The survivors did not forget. They organized, held annual reunions for decades, published accounts, and pushed for the story to be recorded. Their descendants continued it. Almost all of the detailed testimony we have exists because the men who lived through it refused to let it disappear quietly. And there is a strange coda. The Mississippi moved, rivers do, and this one shifted its channel over the following century. In 1982, an expedition searching with magnetic survey equipment found blackened timbers and metal about 2 miles from the modern river, under an Arkansas soybean field. That is where she is, not on a seabed, not marked by a buoy, not visited by submersibles, under farmland in silt, a couple of miles from the water that killed everyone aboard her, with a crop growing over the top of it. There are memorials, and they are modest. Monuments in Tennessee and Ohio put up largely by survivors and their families, a small museum in Arkansas near where she lies, and markers in the towns the dead came from. No national memorial, no anniversary observance, no place in the standard school account of the war. So why does nobody know this? Partly the timing, and partly something less comfortable. The dead were enlisted men, mostly poor, mostly from the rural Midwest, and they died after the war had officially ended, which made them administratively awkward. The country was exhausted and wanted to stop counting. They had been captured, imprisoned, starved, released and told they were going home, and then they were loaded 6 deep onto a boat with a patched boiler because somebody was being paid by the head. Every stage of that was a decision made by somebody who was not on board. History keeps better stories than the syllabus. Subscribe. Next up, our next video.